This is Joita Deodhar from Department of Palliative Medicine, Tata Memorial Hospital. This is on special request of us that Dr. Roopur Sahani, who is a consultant neurologist in Hinduja Hospital, and with his passion for palliative care, as part of our curriculum for MD Palliative Medicine, palliative care in non-oncology and especially neurological disorders is very important. And Dr. Roop has very kindly agreed to take this session on motor neuron disease for us and palliative care aspects of it. We will also have one more session on end of life care policy that will be at a convenient date suitable for Dr. Roop. So everyone knows you actually, Roop, very well. My students are mainly Shreya, Prasun, Prajakta, Jyotsna, Prarthana. Is anyone else there? I cannot see them, but I'm sure they can join later. And Dr. Pragnya, who's our Children's Palliative Care Project Senior Project Officer. So with that, I invite Roop to please give this talk on motor neuron disease.
Right. So thank you, Jayata. So this is a talk that was also meant for neurologists. So you'll see some of it is more directed towards neurology and may seem very basic for palliative care people, but bear with me, I'll skip over that. And I'll begin with a quote that I read a long time ago, which I use for neurologists. The best test of a physician's suitability for the specialized practice of neurology is not his ability to memorize improbable syndromes, but whether he can support a case of motor neuron disease and keep the patient, his relatives, and himself in a reasonably cheerful frame of mind. And this is 1963. Look at self-care there right in the beginning. Right. So all life-limiting neurologic illnesses essentially go through three phases. And obviously, for those of us who come from the palliative care side, we believe that palliative care needs to be involved right from the diagnostic phase, but more often we tend to get involved in the supportive or even in the terminal phase only. So let's first look at the basics of motor neuron disease. Now, I am aware that you guys are mainly from the palliative medicine stream, so I'm teaching you something that you probably last heard of 3 or 4 years ago. And this is to tell you the levels of involvement of the motor neuron. Now, the motor neuron begins in the anterior horn cell in the spinal cord, then proceeds through various roots, plexuses, and so on, basically the peripheral nerves, then passes its information, which is essentially bioelectric, across the neuromuscular junction, and then finally activates the muscle. So if you have diseases in the motor neuron, that is the anterior horn cell, we call those the motor neuron diseases, and they have certain common features. If it is in the peripheral nerve, then you get more involvement of sensory as well as motor. And these, of course, have lots of causes. If it is at the level of connection between the nerve and the muscle, this is called the neuromuscular junction, and you have a disease called myasthenia gravis. And then when you go on to the muscles, you have a whole range of other diseases that you need to deal with, and those are called the myopathies. We obviously are sticking to the motor neuron disease part of the spectrum. Now, the motor neuron diseases are actually a bunch of different disorders which have one common feature, and that is that the motor neuron. And the motor neuron, if you remember, the motor neuron pathway starts off from the cortex, comes down into the spinal cord, and then goes on. So we look at the central neurons as well as the neurons in the spinal cord, and you can have disorders that affect them in varying combinations. And here are the four. This is a kind of split that we see. whether there is upper versus lower motor neuron involvement, whether it is sporadic versus hereditary, and then you have these four broad categories. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which splits into primary lateral sclerosis and progressive muscular atrophy, versus hereditary spastic paraplegia, which is largely starting off from the brain and the pathways below that, and spinal muscular atrophy, which basically is hereditary motor neuron disease starting off in infancy. The key features of motor neuron disease are muscle weakness, muscle wasting, fasciculations, exaggerated reflexes, and absolutely no loss of sensation. And this allows you to split the various features into whether it is involving the lower or the upper motor neuron, whether it is muscles that are supplied by the lower cranial nerves or the muscles of the limbs and trunk. And I'll just run through these various features in a little bit of detail. If the disorder affects the muscles that are supplied by the lower cranial nerves, that means the pharynx, the larynx, and the tongue, the most conspicuous involvement in the early period is in the tongue. And I'll show you a picture of that. The tongue begins to waste, the speech becomes dysarthric, and then swallowing becomes more and more difficult. If it is involving the connections that actually come into the muscles of the lower cranial nerves, which means involving the cortical neurons, then you also have weakness, slowness, and spasticity of all these muscles. Together with, of course, you can have mixes of bulbar and pseudobulbar palsy, but you can have a pure pseudobulbar palsy where there is just these upper motor neuron features with exaggerated jaw jugs, and very often they have an unusual feature that is emotional lability, in which case people cannot control either laughter or crying, and this can actually be quite distressing for both the patient and the family. Whenever the lower cranial nerves are involved, dysarthria, dysphagia, weight loss, and the risk of aspiration all obviously become more and more common. What happens when you have involvement of the muscles of the limbs and trunk? Now you can have pure involvement of the lower motor neuron, which means the spinal cord anterior horn cells, in which case there's weakness, wasting, fasciculation, cramps, and often this starts off in the small muscles of the hand. Or again, like in the pseudobulbar palsy, you can have much more involvement of the upper motor neuron, and there you have weakness, spasticity, clonus, increased reflexes. And in both of these, typically, sphincter control is not effective for various reasons. The nuclei, the cells that control the bladder and the bowel sphincters, are largely smooth muscle, and they stay intact almost to the very end. In terms of diagnostic criteria, obviously, if it is neurological, the diagnosis is going to be complex, but not necessarily so. Definite ALS means that you have a combination of both upper and lower motor neuron signs in at least 3 regions. Probable ALS lab supported, which means signs come up on investigations such as EMG, or possible where you have restricted involvement only in one region, or combinations of 2 regions with lab supported diagnosis. The lab is usually the EMG. There is not much by way of any other kind of biomarker. So you have clinical as well as EMG evidence that we take for making this diagnosis. But remember that there is also a category of familial ALS in which patients have a positive family history or an identified gene mutation and then start to develop upper or lower motor neuron signs. Even if they are in only one region, you may take this as a positive diagnosis. So just to reiterate, definite ALS would mean a combination of upper and lower motor neuron signs in at least three regions. And what MND does not have is any of the following. There is no sensory involvement. These patients till a very late stage will not be ataxic, which means they will be weak, but they will not have cerebral ataxia. There is usually no autonomic involvement. Eye movements and sphincter control, as I told you earlier, are lost very, very late, to the point that a person can be completely paralyzed on the ventilator and able to communicate only by eye movements. Though, of course, there's a stage beyond that where even the eye movements are lost. I put that practical into inverted commas because, as you can imagine, this comes from a neurology textbook. So, sporadic or acquired amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is about 90% of all cases. And you can have n number of presentations. So people can present with something that looks like a hemiplegia, which means in the beginning, the involvement is only on one side. Or it can be purely distal, so it looks like a peripheral neuropathy. Flail arm, this means that the proximal weakness of the upper limb dominates, and these are patients who just can't move their shoulders, but can move their hands. Or it can be only one limb, that's monomelic. Or it can be a pure bulbar onset. I have only once seen somebody who came in only with breathing problems, or progressive muscular atrophy, which means somebody who only wastes away, or somebody who has only brisk reflexes, or somebody who starts and continues with only bulbar palsy. Familial ALS is rapidly expanding as more and more genes are found. SOD1 is one of the genes that is involved in motor neuron generation, so it's pretty prominent. And a little lower down, you will see an interesting, if I can find my, sorry, where is my, I don't know where my arrow has disappeared. But right down, if you look, FTD ALS overlap. Now that is something that has turned up in the last 2 decades or so. Where, and again, I didn't have the time to go into that. If you look at degenerative disorders of the nervous system, there are certain basic mechanisms, and these mechanisms can overlap across parts of the nervous system. So you can have a patient who has degeneration of the frontal lobes. So that is frontotemporal dementia. You may have heard of Pick's disease and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This overlap typically comes up with a gene mutation called C9orf72. And these typically are patients who not only have a family history, but begin in the 40s. And these can be devastating illnesses. Just to show you what this looks like in clinical practice, the most common presentation is hand wasting. In people who have more proximal involvement, one characteristic presentation is what is called the dropped head, where somebody just can't get their head up. And as I told you earlier, when the bulbar involvement is there, probably the most common sight that you will see is a wasted and fibrillating tongue. But you look closely at the tongue and it looks like a bag of worms. And that's what it is described. Now, once you made the diagnosis, I don't need to tell an audience of people from palliative care background the importance of telling the truth. And we know that truth telling is something that needs to be done in small doses. What I need to point out to you that in motor neuron disease, practicing in neurology in India, typically you will find that neurologists very often drop the ball on this, on informing the patient about the diagnosis. And this slide is obviously for a neurology audience to tell them that you cannot build a therapeutic alliance with the patient without telling her the truth about her illness. And concealment and collusion begin the process of abandonment because neurologists are not trained in palliative care. I mean, neuropalliative care is an even newer subspecialty. Very often, my specialty, my colleagues end up abandoning the patient. And it's interesting. I think this is an insight that I have had for some time now. And that is that collusion begins when the first person who makes the diagnosis does not tell it. If the first person takes that challenge head on, typically when the diagnosis comes out, the immediate family is also grappling with the challenge. And if you tell them, if as a neurologist, if I were to tell them very clearly, and this has been happening for at least the past 2 or 3 years now, if I tell them what it is, if I tell the family that it is my business to tell the patient, get them on board, then collusion just has no chance to happen. Because collusion typically in the Indian setting happens when the wider family gets involved. When the Tauji and the Chachi ji and the Masi ji and everybody come into the picture, and then they kind of bombard the immediate family with this idea that the truth must not be told. For neurologists, obviously, they need to know more about the social history and so on. And I'm not going to go into the details of spikes, except that I repeatedly tell them that neurologists, that is, if they are not comfortable handling this, then they really need to get palliative care involved right at this stage, because this is a huge burden later on. Firing a warning shot, typically for me, I break this down into multiple consults. So in the first consult, I may send them off for investigations after having fired the warning shot. And typically, I will warn them that bad news is coming. I give them the diagnosis. I usually leave the rest of this, meaning that there is no cure, that the prognosis is highly variable, and so on, for the second consult. I usually mention that the prognosis is highly variable. And that is really true, because in some patients, survival for 5, 10 or more years is possible. All of us have heard the story of Hawking, who went on for years and years. Though we are not sure about exactly what his particular type of motor neuron disease, we feel that it was probably something closer to a spinal muscular atrophy. And obviously, again, for a palliative care audience, I don't need to tell all this. What we do need to, as neurologists, tell them that discuss the reasons for hope. Explain that the complications are treatable. Explain that every attempt will be made to maintain the function, and make this promise of non-abandonment. Patient support groups, neuroprotective treatment, and so on are all part of the course. And patient support groups, I'll again come back to this a little later. This is something that we are in the initial stages of in Mumbai. And that's something that perhaps you need to also disseminate and help us and get involved. And one last thing that I typically do as an Indian neurologist is acknowledge a willingness to get a second opinion. In fact, I push them for a second opinion before I take on the second part of the consult where I discuss all these details. So it takes about 2 to 3 weeks before the second and the detailed discussion happens with the patient and family. Reassurance is obviously important. There is a certain neuroprotective treatment which is available, and we need to explain both information on assistance and symptomatic treatments, explain that many complications are treatable, and then we propose a follow-up meeting in 2 or 4 weeks' time. So the steps that I use are towards the end of the first consultation, give the correct name of the possible diagnosis, suggest a second opinion, and then I usually use this as a step. In the presence of the family, I specifically ask the patient, Do you want to talk to me about this illness, or would you prefer that I talk to XYZ? Now, why do I do this? One is in the early stages of the illness, there is always my lack of knowledge of the social setting of this family and what their family dynamics are. But also, I may not be totally aware of how cognitively intact the patient is, because some patients do lose, we call them frontal lobe functions, and I'm not going to go into the details, and decision making does tend to get impaired. And you may want to leave that to the family to sort out before they come back. Of course, I know that this happens in oncology as well, but this is not something that neurologists do usually. Okay, so let's move on to the next stage, and that is that diagnosis has been done and confirmed. Now, before I leave the diagnostic part of it, let me put one more thing on the table, and that is the fact that in some patients, the diagnosis may not be clear for as long as 6 months or even a year into the illness. And because the diagnosis is not clear, and because they kind of juggle between this in this uncertain phase, they may carry this search for all kinds of therapies and second opinions into later in the illness. And that is where somewhere I think it needs a neurologist and the palliative care team to get together and kind of make it certain that this is an and basically an incurable illness. Right. So when I said incurable illness, well, there are some therapeutic possibilities, and let me run through them. The first is riluzole. Now, the basic mechanism of this anterior horn cell degeneration is something called excitotoxicity. You may have heard of the term the biochemical glutamate. It's a neurotransmitter, and an excess of its activity causes excitotoxicity, and that is supposed to be the mechanism by which the anterior horn cells die. Riluzole is a drug that suppresses the action of glutamate, and it can be used orally. Now, in trials, it has been shown to extend survival by some months. That's it. It is not a cure. So it just extends survival, and that too seems to be obvious in trials, not necessarily in individual patients. The other drug, which is anti-glutamatergic, which has been used, is edaravone. And edaravone is used intravenously. There is a protocol in which it is given in 60 milligrams per day for 14 days, followed by a break, and then repeated. And these cycles can go on. Now, occasional patients will show significant change, and typically this happens with patients who are losing swallowing. So I almost always offer patients this, and those patients who feel that they are benefiting will continue. Those who don't will typically, after about 2 or 3 cycles, give up. It's important to know that riluzole is available free. Sun Pharma distributes it as a therapeutic, as a charitable initiative. And edaravone also is not very expensive by Indian standards. It's something that almost all our patients can afford, so all patients take it, which is not true of the rest of the world, where these are drugs that people find pretty expensive. Now, intravenous immunoglobulins you will have heard about this, are used in as an immune therapy. And one of the far out kind of differential diagnosis of cases like this is an odd immune neuropathy. So in doubtful cases, I would say maybe 1 out of 50 or so, we might just give them a course of immunoglobulin to see if they do well. Sooner or later, you need to address the question of magic remedies. And let me assure you, stem cell treatments, as they are performed in India, are a scam. They are a rip-off.
Mm-hmm.
Why do they work? They work because the price has been pitched right. It is a price that uh, even a lower middle class individual family can squeeze out about 2 to 3 lakhs. So they get sold. And because they get sold, um, too often patients and families say, ठीक है, उतना तो खर्च करके देख लेते. And as far as possible, I very clearly tell them that that's not all. Now, prognostic issues, as you can understand, as patients become aware, you do discuss that swallowing and breathing difficulties will come up. We leave these issues for discussion later. Obviously, the promise of continued care and non-abandonment is very important. There are some indicators of rapid progression. Typically, if they are involved swallowing early, then they tend to go down faster. The classic uh, hand start usually goes on for about 3 to 5 years. And riluzole use, as I said, may prolong survival. Respiratory muscle involvement obviously is a negative. So as you go along, you realize which patients are beginning to go down faster. And this uh, rarely takes us longer than 6 months to a year to figure out. Okay. Now, what are the things that you can do for them? I'll actually do a review of all of these possibilities. But one of the first that comes up is exercise. Now, there has been some discussion in your journals also about how you can use your exercise here. Remember that range of motion is absolutely safe. So, which means that even the weakest of patients, you see that all joints, a full range of movement is done so that no contractures occur. And this is pretty good for both spasticity and cramps. Obviously, a therapist would need to do this on an individual basis, and even the home caregiver can do this. What about weight training? There has been some discussion about whether using weights may actually cause overweight weakness. But it's now understood that mild to moderate resistance is safe, and my patients, at least those of them who are doing reasonably well, like it. What you watch for is prolonged muscle soreness and post-exercise exhaustion that goes on for more than about 15 minutes, and then you need to cut out that. Aerobic exercise obviously is safe and is both beneficial for mood as well as well-being. The other motor symptom that bothers people is spasticity and cramps. Now, I'm jumping to fasciculations first because they are very prominent and some patients get really disturbed by them, but they are not painful. So, ideally, although I've given this treatment of anti-epileptics, carbamazepine, phenytoin at the bottom, the best treatment for that is reassurance. What about cramps and spasticity? Cramps, the problem is the drug that we should have, quinine benzoate, is not very easily available. And when it has to be used, it can cause, it has issues. So unless somebody has really very painful cramps, I would avoid using it. For spasticity, you have baclofen and tizanidine. These are drugs that I'm sure even you guys use. Baclofen is probably the easier to use. You start off, both 10 and 25 mg tablets are available and you build them up gradually. The main side effect is drowsiness, and the contraindication is hypertension. One problem that bothers patients, especially when they have prominent pseudovulvar, which means upper motinon bulb involvement, is drooling, and that irritates them like nothing. Uh, you can use anticholinergics, and both nortriptyline and amitriptyline drugs that you guys also use are pretty safe. A scopolamine patch is something that you know as well as I do. But one thing that you could probably try is atropine eye drops. And these produce almost instant relief. Just one drop into the mouth, and that person will be dry for the mouth will be dry for about 6 months. So if it is something that fluctuates, or if they would like to be use it for a cosmetic, for a function or something like that, then if it is really, really bad, then Botox can be given in the parotid or submandibular glands, and many people now do this. The last resort is radiotherapy to the salivary glands. What about pseudovulvar effect? Now, this is people who cannot control visible emotions. Now, sometimes these are actual emotions, but often they're distorted emotions. So the person is actually feeling sad and is laughing hysterically. And this can obviously be very distressing to both family and to the patient. So simple thing to use is first antidepressants. Fluoxetine actually is my favorite drug for this, but amitriptyline and clomipramine can also be used. But the drug that really works is something called Nudexta. It is not available in India, even though I've tried to get this. Patients have to import this, and uh, between 1 to max 3 tablets per day is possible. Now, I'll come back to this about how these drugs that are not available in India to be procured, and we'll discuss that a little later. The big problem as you go along is communication. And one of the things that I found very useful is to tell the patient directly that I'll answer all your questions, but sometimes you may not be able to, I may not be able to understand what you're saying in a busy clinic. So do you mind working with your family and writing these down before you come for the consultation so that I can address each of them individually? There are lots of augmentative and alternative communication devices that are available. And this was a slide that I pulled down from the net almost about, I think, 2 years ago, and I'm sure it's already outdated. Probably the best that I have seen, and that takes a little bit of tech savvy family and patient to use, is a eye motion tracker. So the eye motion tracker basically picks out a keyboard on the laptop or the desktop, and you can actually tap out letters and words. So a person, there's a laser beam which focuses on a letter, and a blink is like an enter key, so they can actually tap out full word sentences and so on. I think the price for the whole thing is still in the range of about $1.5 lakh. I've seen a couple of patients in our support group demonstrate that. Pain. Now, pain is something that you're pretty often used to dealing with in cancer. This pain is different. And I remember a palliative care physician from the UK really demonstrating it to us. He said to the audience, I was in the audience, and he said, just sit without any movement at all for the next 2 minutes. And he actually made us do that. And you realize how difficult it is. We are all, all through the day, even through the night, we are basically relieving pressure on our various parts of the body. And if that is not possible, patients can get a lot of pain. And towards the end, this is a pain that patients have internalized so much that they don't realize it. It takes an expert physician very often to figure out that this is also there, and to try a good dose of paracetamol, and patients actually do well with that. So towards the end, you might want to think of using paracetamol liberally if somebody has visible pain, even though the patient denies it. What about motor weakness and mobility? For upper body weakness, for a long stage, you can use adaptive tools. For lower body, braces, crutches, walkers, powered wheelchairs, all of those are possible. Unless, of course, the disability is progressing too fast. By the time you've gotten used to one, you're onto the next stage. For the dropped head syndrome, soft and hard neck collars work well. Other medications that our patients often use is vitamins and supplements. There's a lot of literature uh, on the grey net about high dose methylcobalamin, and this is high dose, which means you would be taking, if you know our standard methylcobal tablets, if you take uh, one tablet of the standard methylcobalamin supplement that is available, your vitamin B12 level will be over the therapeutic level instantly. And these people take 25, 30 times that. So those tablets again need to be imported. Statins have been used. We are not very sure if they are useful, but probably not. One thing to remember is that these patients need proactive vaccination with the flu vaccine and with pneumovax and with the zoster vaccine. Just to run over the symptomatic management, I haven't covered fatigue here, but fatigue is pretty prominent early in the stage. Pyridostigmine bromide can be used. So also you can use other drugs like methylphenidate and amantadine. For spasticity, we've already discussed that. For people who have painful jaw clenching, and this is like a cramp, you can use Botox. Quinine sulfate for cramps, fasciculations, we've covered. Sialorrhea, pseudovulvar laughing crying, we've covered. Thick phlegm. Again, these are patients who have, towards the later part, have difficulty in bringing out their sputum. And here, nebulized saline, nebulized N-acetylcysteine can both be used. A good chest therapist or respiratory therapist can use insufflation, exsufflation. People have tried adequate rehydration. Then chest wall oscillation therapy. Again, these are devices that are not regularly available in India, but if you can get hold of them, they can be useful. And some people have suggested reduced intake of dairy products. I'm not really sure about that. For aspiration, you need a dietitian to get involved. For joint pains, as I said, paracetamol works well. Depression, insomnia, again, I'm not getting into that. And constipation, I think palliative care physicians are far better at it than most other physicians and neurologists. Okay. The important thing is that if you look through all of this, you know very obviously that this is ALS needs a multidisciplinary. A neurologist, a nurse coordinator, bringing in physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, dietitian, social worker, pulmonologist, respiratory physician. Is there an MDT for ALS anywhere in India? No, there isn't. Really, there isn't. So, just as I speak, a few weeks ago, a colleague of mine and I have been wondering about whether we can, in these times of Corona, see if we can put this together on a virtual basis. It'll be interesting to see. It's an experiment. And Jayita, if you want to think of this as a research project, you're welcome.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about this, but this is something that is there. Okay, so basically you're looking at a holistic approach to maintain functional independence as long as possible with psychosocial support for patient and for family. So, what psychosocial support? Well, one of the things that I found out, to my surprise, and this came from the son of a patient. He pointed me to the buyers. They're both in their 80s. They're both in living in assisted living now. This was their son, Ben, who went down pretty rapidly. As you can see, he died over a 4 or 5 year period, and this was when he was in his late 30s or early 40s. I forget which. So they made it their life's mission to provide worldwide support. And what do? They look for all kinds of therapies that have been tried out, provided, of course, that they are not obviously harmful or, so the High-dose methylcobalamin comes from them. They help with procuring Nudexta, and they are they were instrumental in helping us set up uh, uh, an ALS MND support service here. Right now, this is still largely online, but I mean, now, of course, in the Corona period, it's become completely online. It's volunteer based. We have some support from Palcare. Palcare is helping us. They do take on MND patients when we involve them. So we have been getting hospice care for our MND patients through them. And as I said, we are looking at seeing if we can actually get an MDT, an online MDT to get. As these patients go down, you require cardiac and pulmonary evaluation. And this becomes especially important if they have intercurrent illnesses and require surgery. There is a question about surgery worsening ALS, but the main worry is if somebody is marginal, then you can end up with extubation failure. And here, if by chance that occurs, then you need to pull it as long as possible before you make the decision to go on for a tracheostomy. When do you start discussing end of life? Of course, when the patient or family asks for it, or if there is severe psychological suffering, or if the dysphagia starts to require a feeding tube. Now, one of the other things that happens is that simultaneously, as dysphagia worsens, FVC also, forced vital capacity also starts to drop. And that's something that the neurologist or the MDT needs to keep an eye on, and loss of function becomes very severe. So again, this was for neurologists, and I'll not bother with this too much, except to point out that both neurologists and palliative care physicians working together need to be very clear about eliciting preference-sensitive decisions early on. Be clear about shared decision-making here. Be clear about assessing whole body pain. And because the decision-making now shifts into the usage of percutaneous feeding, endoscopic gastrostomy, non-invasive ventilation, and invasive ventilation. And you, the neurologist especially, has been very clear to be sure whether the patient is cognitively intact. Because if a patient has significant frontal lobe impairment, their ability to be aware of their responsibilities to the family deteriorates. I won't go into this. I won't go into this either, except to point out that advanced care planning is obviously very, very relevant here. Now, the first point of decision usually is a PEG. Of course, before that, you will use food and fluid adaptation, do postural adjustments, get in a speech therapist to help. And if there is both dysphagia and the weight loss is more than 10% in a period of, I would say, between 3, I wouldn't go as long as stretching it over 6 months, I would say closer to 3 months, a worsening of respiratory function, you need to think about putting in a PEG. So once these usually will need a speech therapist fairly early on. And you need to discuss the PEG early, because there is another issue. And that is if you start discussing a PEG when the forced vital capacity has dropped below 30% or is between 30 to 50%, then you have a patient who's at risk of needing intubation as during the procedure itself. And you can imagine how catastrophic that could be, especially if the patient is not very sure about going on to using a tracheostomy. So typically, when the forced vital capacity is more than 50%, we actually need to push them to use a PEG if they are sure that they would like to go on. There are patients who would refuse it, and that is something that needs to be discussed. What about respiratory support? That comes up more and more as forced vital capacity drops below 50%. Typically, the clinical signs of tachypnea and orthopnea are there, but the symptoms appear at night. So nocturnal hypoxemia comes up with frequent nocturnal awakenings, excessive daytime sleepiness, nocturnal polyuria, morning headaches, vivid or bad dreams. And if it gets worse, then these patients also start to get confused. So these are signs that one needs to watch out for. And again, these are guidelines for neurologists about what you can use. Usually, I would have a respiratory pulmonologist involved here, and they would then help us with various other possibilities before you go on to non-invasive ventilation. And again, if anybody wants this, I'll pass this on. So the possible respiratory interventions that we have are cuff assist or flutter valve devices. These are external. The respiratory muscle training can be used. Newer NIV models and mouthpiece ventilators are possible. Of course, eventually, if some patients do want it, then tracheostomy can be provided. Now, counseling for invasive ventilation is a little tricky. This is because patients can survive in the long term with invasive ventilation. The problem is that a ventilated patient, a patient with a tracheostomy, after a period of time, the quality of life of the patient stabilizes, but the quality of life of the caregiver continues to deteriorate, and you can understand that. You have more and more caregiving that is required, and the family needs to, I mean, this counseling is fairly heavy duty. As I said earlier, patients whose behavior is a little off, whose levels of empathy seem to be off, may need specific assessment to see whether how much they should be part of this decision. Can you set up ventilation NIV at home? Yes, you can. It's not cheap, but it is not terribly expensive. So the Philips BiPAP would cost between, say, about a little less than a lakh. I think it's about a lakh now, or a little over that. The invasive ventilation, INV, is about 3 lakhs and about 30,000 per month. And some patients can get through with an oxygen concentrator. How do patients get onto tracheostomies? I believe it is very much to do with the neurologist who's involved here. And this was an interesting study which looked at neurologists recommending invasive ventilation. At the time this was done, this was about 5-6 years ago, the numbers in the US of neurologists recommending invasive ventilation was just about 20%. In Japan, they were much more. And yet, when the question was flipped and the neurologists were asked, would you want a ventilator if you had ALS? Over 70% of neurologists, both in Japan and US, were categorical. They wouldn't want it. So at the end, what is important is if you're not using invasive ventilation, then you need to use cuff assist devices. You need to manage secretions. Glycopyrrolate is something that you guys are familiar with. And then obviously morphine needs to start coming in. And towards the end, it can obviously be given subcutaneously. These are hospice criteria in the US. And again, I will leave this. This is actually from a palliative care journal, but I can put this together for you guys. And when does specialist palliative care need to be involved? These are situations that should not be difficult to judge. Again, this was for a neurology audience. But there is one thing that I need to cover here, which is not always easy to discuss with a palliative care audience, and that is physician-assisted dying. Medical aid in dying or physician-assisted dying is a bit of a holy cow in palliative care. But remember that for somebody like me who does generalist palliative care, it is something that is much, much closer to us. We have to answer that to our patients very often. In India, obviously, it's not possible, but in the US, this is the most common neurologic cause for physician-assisted dying. And there's now enough literature out in uh, uh, our journals as well. So I'm going to close with this. Most of you have my email ID and my mobile number. I'll try and put the essentials of this into a PDF and send it across to Jaita, and then she can disseminate it to you. I'll close this and you can take questions. Jaita?
Yes, thank you very much, Roop. Very, very comprehensive and yeah, of course, very practical, which is what we wanted to learn from you, because, you know, it's something in the books, but the same things we would read, but then when you discuss it, that makes much more sense to us and gives us a meaning, because we don't see these patients we don't, I mean, in Tata, because we are in Tata, we don't see these patients. I'm sure there will be other questions coming. I just wanted to know, how often do you see FTD as part of ALS?
Yeah, so
I haven't seen many.
no, so the last really frank patient I remember was, I think 3 or 4 years ago. Really frank. So, for one thing, people who have FTD, frontotemporal dementia, the frontotemporal dementia dominates the story. And because that dominates the story, they end up going, I mean, they're mainly taken care of by the cognitive neurologists. And the ALS is then not such a big part of it.
Yeah, because that will be really, really difficult. I mean, of course, the FTD, even as cognitive impairment is part of ALS, it's difficult to manage. But then a full-fledged FTD with ALS, that becomes this thing. So can we open it to others who are asking questions now?
So they won't speak. No, they won't be allowed to speak. But what we'll do is we'll take their chats.
They can put it on the chat.
Chats or question answer, whatever they have.
Question answer, yeah. We can do that.
Yeah, if they put it on chats. Otherwise, I mean, why don't you keep asking questions and then we can take it?
Yeah, I asked my question, but I'm sure the residents have their own questions to ask. Yeah, right. There is one.
Okay. Depression, a standard therapy. Obviously, if you have a fair amount of cyalluria, then you would prefer anticholinergics. Otherwise, then you would go on to using. Jaita, you want to take that?
So I think it should go on to, I don't think there are any specific guidelines for depression in neurological disorders, but we have guidelines for depression with chronic physical illness. So the main elements would be about the type of features and the drug-drug interactions and of the medicines, and that is on. So I think because it is sialluria, you have a good evidence for TCAs being used, especially in a younger patients. Of course, older patients, we would not give that, although SSRIs are always, SSRIs or SNRIs are the first line treatment. We wouldn't do it, but I think we need to tailor it to the symptoms that are there. So there's one more question from Prasoon, who thanks you. What is the mechanism of action of ultra high dose methylcobalamin? Which I think you said that already. Anyway, if you want to answer that.
Yeah. So that's again one of those things that has come out of the buyers and the ALS network. So again, I've seen patients use it, but there is no literature on it. And I see no reason why it should be useful, except that, I don't know, maybe hypothetically very high doses knocking off glutamate somewhere, but nobody's proved it.
Yeah, but there'll be adverse effects as well. So
no, that's one thing you can have.
Don't do?
No. One thing is that you can pour B12 by the bucket, literally down in B12.
There is one more question. What is the reason behind the emotional lability seen in pseudobulbar palsy?
Okay, so much of this control that we have comes through the corticobulbar pathways. And these are, uh, your laughter or your crying, the emotions are obviously set from above, but the mechanisms are in the brainstem. So if there's a disconnection, you could have the mechanism like running wild, and that is the most likely mechanism because there is a disconnect between the upper and the lower levels.
Yeah, I think it's